Hey guys, thanks for tuning in for the special segment here on News Channel Nebraska. Columbus Mayor Jim Bulkley joining me over there, and Congressman Fortenberry joining me as well. I'm Grant Otten, and we're glad you spoke with a lot of leaders here in Columbus today. And before we get into some questions, I guess, what were some takeaways for you? Was it anything surprising? I'm sure most of it you already kind of knew coming into the meeting, but what were some takeaways from that gathering?
It was a great meeting. Of course, Columbus is a wonderful place to live and work and raise a family, and it's a great privilege for me to be your representative in the United States Congress. But when I'm back, I like to try as best I can to integrate with the communities I serve, and so to have a spectrum of leadership there today, from the business community, the governmental sector, the faith community, the law enforcement community, as well as others who are doing various types of community service, creates conditions in which we can all hear one another. And so, yes, there were general concerns about the ag economy, the negotiations, the necessary renegotiations that are in process around trade and how they are potentially affecting some of the supply, particularly of steel, that affects certain manufacturers here in a significant way. The concern that farmers ag is one of the last things we produce in America on a great scale. Without ag products, our trade imbalances would be much, much worse. And yet at the same time, this of course is held in creative tension with the reality that I think most people want America to do better in these trade deals. All farmers are good Americans and they want to see better trade deals. But we just got to nimbly negotiate this so that agriculture is not retaliated against. And then the subset problem of the spike in steel prices affects manufacturing. Law enforcement, I think, was something that it's a narrative that I'm hearing more and more. You know, we all honor our military veterans and those who serve, and appropriately so. We've created a cultural movement. There's not a person out there who doesn't even people who disagree with maybe whatever conflict we're in, but wouldn't honor the veteran. And yet with our law enforcement, who are out there on the front line, putting themselves at risk, and there's problem solving. Most of what they do is problem solve all day long. The diminished, the tainting of what they do, and their diminished national reputation as well, is actually hurting recruiting. And this is a sad reality because it's a noble form of public service. So we talked about that a bit, as well as, again, just trying to figure out a way in which Columbus's good problems of having lots and lots of jobs and opportunities can actually be filled, and some dynamics in which the school systems are better integrating with business, and businesses showing necessary leadership to help the school system to promote the types of learning that will translate readily into wonderful opportunities. So it was a broad and good discussion.
And recently you had some visitors from Columbus up in Washington, and it was a wide variety of city, county, chamber officials. When you get a chance to have those visits, how important are those for you as well, on top of now getting back here to speak a little bit with your local leaders?
Oh, they're very important. Of course, we welcome anybody who's coming from Nebraska to see us in Washington. The problem in Washington is the schedule is so difficult and so tight and so fragmented that you don't have the length of time to unpack issues like we did today. So that's why it was great to be back in the community.
And Mayor, when you talk about getting a chance to just work with Congressman Fortenberry, what's that been like for you? And have you been able to maybe get anything accomplished, I guess, is what you're hoping to translate from your local businesses and your constituents here in town?
Well, let me start by thanking the Congressman for what he did today, coming out here to speak to everybody, not just a few. You know, the group that, as he said, was put together with community leaders, education, police, and everybody with their own concerns. But it's kind of unique. Those concerns aren't very large. I mean, they're a pretty common set of concerns. And then translate that to last week when we were in Washington. That was my third trip. Second as mayor. I had gone years ago, before your term, I would actually believe, but had gone out as one of the councilmen. Yeah, but this was my second one as mayor, and having the opportunity to see the congressmen, see their staff interact with us and listen, and you really do get a feel that they listen. We were able to make some concrete advances on some things that we got some help from the congressman on. So it makes us feel good. We do see value in those trips. I know sometimes people probably wonder, well, another trip to Washington. Well, if you go very often, you don't think of another trip to Washington.
Right.
There's other places I might choose if we couldn't get the value that we get out of it. So we thank you for that, Congressman.
One thing good that actually happened, we're talking about large structural issues affecting the nation, whether that's agriculture or imports or shifting the educational system to conform better to opportunities that are out there while also helping them. In the Federal Aviation Administration bill, again, a working bill that creates the regulatory environment for our nation's aircraft industry, the mayor and the chamber and Columbus officials have been pushing for a long time for a small change, but that actually saves Columbus $300,000.
$300,000.
So we got that in the House bill. And again, in the big scheme of things, we're working on big scheme things, but sometimes it translates down to certain communities' needs, and they were very helpful in suggesting this change, which will save them additional money.
And I know City Administrator Tara Vasicek was very
Tara
excited
pointed
about
that out,
Yeah,
yes.
so, well, when we look at some of the current stuff that's happening too, and I think one that a lot of people are interested in North and South Korea, them kind of reconciling after all this time, or wherever that's at this point, do you see that having an impact here on towns like Columbus, Norfolk, towns in rural Nebraska?
Well, let me respond to that in 3 ways. First of all, every week I put out an email called the Fort Report, and anybody's welcome to sign up for it. And this week I wrote on that fact, and in fact I entitled the report, "A North Korea Miracle," with a question mark. Now, we're a long way from the fullness of possibility of what could exist there, but it is amazing to me that just 2 months ago, our president had to say to Kim Jong-un, "Our button is bigger than yours," in effect. And yet, at the same time, the gravity, the seriousness of the potential for conflict and the United States being drawn into it was very real and still continues to be real. This is a person who's killed his own relatives, and he has absolute control over society. His people starve, and yet his military infrastructure and his elites live like kings. So it's grossly unfair. What changed? We've had some very hard-hitting international sanctions. The international community, for the most part, has been in unison in this regard. The United States, we have sent the message, we will defend ourselves. South Korea has played an invaluable role, hosting the Olympics. Kim Jong-un's representatives were there, the Americans, we were there, all proximate to one another. And perhaps, maybe in a little way, this was affirmed by the South Korean ambassador who I talked to about this, that created enough of a cordiality, enough of a space, along with the real hard-hitting effects of both the economic sanctions as well as the potential of sending the message that we will defend ourselves, along with the wild card, and the wild card is China. Remember, Kim Jong-un went to China secretly about a month ago. And the Chinese control, in effect, his energy supply. I don't know what was said, we're not fully sure what was said, but let's roll it all into one, and he makes overtures for peace, and let's seize the moment, in my mind. There's no reason, there is no rational reason that two peoples who are inextricably intertwined can 1 mile apart live gravely different lives. And if he can show sincerity and walk back his nuclear program with the potential of even potentially removing it, that helps us walk back our long-term troop presence there and maybe create a new set of conditions in which both Koreas can fully flourish. Again, a big if, it's a long way. Now, it's also a long way from Columbus, but I think the people have sent me to Washington to work on these fundamental issues of how we keep ourselves safe, as well as create a new architecture for the 21st century in which we use of course, our economic leverage, have a strong military deterrent, but also project the desire for authentic relationships. If these relationships are just transactional, or they're just based upon what we can get from them and they can get from us, just economic, that's not authentic. So if Kim Jong-un's sentiments are real, and they'll be tested, to seize this moment and potentially create a whole new chapter in what Korea could be, would be hugely beneficial to him and his country, and hugely beneficial to us. And we spend a significant amount of time, frankly, in, again, this, what I call creating the 21st century architecture for authentic diplomatic relations. Because we're not the lone superpower anymore. And we can shoot our way out of anything. But you have to build up the conditions for trust and goodwill, and then create linkages that ultimately preserves the peace. now you have the backup of a strong military just in case something goes wrong.
I would think the range of people's concern for an issue like that specifically would either range from it's so far away, does it affect me, or that's an issue that affects everybody. Where do you think people need to sit on that when you talk about constituents here in Columbus who are quite a ways obviously from the
Right.
Koreas?
Well, of course, in Nebraska, we also have strategic command. That's the main command structure of our nuclear enterprise, both our nuclear weapons use policy and our non-proliferation policy. Centers here right in Nebraska, so there's a direct linkage there. Frankly, nuclear non-proliferation, the threat of nuclear war, is so hard to get the mind around that it is remote for most people. Especially, look, when you're trying to work hard and raise your family well and make ends meet, it's just a bigger issue than most people are worrying about moment by moment. But it is my job to try to keep us safe. So I am hopeful, astounded by the turn of events, and also try to communicate this message back in Nebraska, because it is something that we all have to be concerned about. In a moment, life could change and change radically forever if one of these nuclear weapons goes off. So if North Korea we could back away from this precipice and start to turn the nature of the relationship, use it as a good example, again, of rebuilding diplomacy around authentic relations. Does it have implications for elsewhere in the world? I think it does. So this could be extraordinary. It could be a miracle.
Let's switch topics a little bit here. Now we talk about the majority in the House of Representatives potentially switching over here. What do you see as an impact for people in Columbus and these other rural communities if that does take place?
Yeah. Well, look, the country is divided philosophically and therefore politically. And people are even sorting themselves out by geography. There's a book that sits on my shelf at home. It's called The Big Sort. It was given to me a few years ago by someone who was analyzing the reality that not only are people being divided philosophically, but they're actually sorting themselves geographically by this fact. And you see this, East Coast, West Coast versus Midwest and South and other dynamics. That's a bit sad, because I think we ought to have a narrative as a nation, know who we are, our great tradition, pass that forward in time. And so we have a vision of where we're going. But that is under great stress, and it plays itself out daily in Congress. Of course, sorry, but the media exploits this tension for its own ratings, particularly not you, but nationally. You do good work locally. But nationally, and you see that, and then the media is divided up into base constituency. Anybody can sort of have their perspective affirmed by switching channels. And it upsets people. And I'm, as a representative, or am accessible to people, and so they are upset, and they send, appropriately express that degree of angst to me. So I don't know how this will translate. Of course, there'll be a big political fight in the fall over the control of the House of Representatives. I think most people in Nebraska want you to stand and fight for your good principles and still work for something to get done. That's what I think.
Yeah, and Mayor, I'll ask you this: when you hear thoughts again, we'll kind of touch back on the meeting we had today. Regulations seem to be the big thing, and I know you've worked in ag for a long time, and so from your perspective, what are you hearing from your business owners and your different groups in Columbus about the federal regulations, where they think that stuff needs to be at?
Well, I think regulations, and it was touched on, Congressman, that anything that can happen to reduce the scope of federal regulations. Aaron, the superintendent from Lakeview, mentioned, and I may not have the percentage right, but the scope of federal regulations.
4% funding, 80%
Yeah,
regulations.
thank you. You made note of that. 4% funding, 80% regulation. All right, so it's so large. We've had a concern with our friends at Luke Power trying to get their licensing done for so many years and for so many $1 million. So, anything that we can do to common sense our federal government just helps us all.
Yeah.
Just helps us all.
Can I ask you to expand on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. One of the problems that exists in our country, back to this philosophical tension, is what is the proper role of the federal government versus local government versus state government? And I'll be at Columbus High School in a moment, and one of the things I'll do is I'll ask them, I'll say, how many of you drive? Okay, good. How many of you stopped at that red octagonal sign at the intersection this morning on your way to school? Good. Why did you stop? And then we'll discuss the nature of the law. But then we'll go to who enforces that law. That's not the U.S. Army sitting there. That's the local Columbus police or the sheriff, or if they're out on the highway, the state police. So there's different levels of government. Fundamentally, you ought to be trying to make a decision. Whoever's closest to a problem or opportunity ought to be empowered to either seize the opportunity or solve the problem. Those of us who are farther away, national government, on local affairs have less and less a role. But you've seen this fight in education, particularly as there's been a tendency to want to consolidate education policy nationally. I believe that's best left up to local considerations. Now, military policy, keeping our world safe, nuclear policy, diplomatic policy, making sure that national infrastructure is robust enough so that we can have good commerce, enforcing laws on contracts and what we call the social good, that's all national things. The way the streets are paved, the way the snowplow comes out, the way the local police are enforcing laws, that's the mayor's business, and it's not mine. So it'll be a philosophical discussion at the school, but to try to get back to this notion that we can't nationalize every conceivable set of problems, because the outcomes, the regulatory overlay, will actually be disruptive to the potential good that occurs. So it's a balance. I'm not an anti-federal government guy. I think the federal government has certain defined roles that it ought to be doing very well. But I also believe in something called federalism, or philosophically subsidiarity. People who are closest to a problem ought to be empowered to solve that problem, or closest to an opportunity, be empowered to seize that opportunity.
Congressman, you're busy, so thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Pleasure visiting you.
Mayor, thank you so much too.
Thank you, Grant.
Handshake.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Handshakes all around. Guys, thank you for tuning in as well for this special presentation here on News Channel Nebraska. For Mayor Bulkley and Congressman Fortenberry, I'm Grant Otten. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks.